Hi, fifth graders. Welcome back to the Fabled fourth graders of Aesop Elementary Read Aloud. Kelvin goes to kindergarten. It was math time in Mr. Jupiter's class. All right, students, said Mr. Jupiter, you have 2 minutes to do your multiplication test. He flipped over his hourglass. Made from the sands of the Sahara Desert, he explained. Ready, set, go. The fourth graders attacked their papers. Most of them were already up to the 16s and the 17s. Emberley was on the 29s. Stanford, you guessed it, was on the 34s. Kelvin Tallywong, still on the 3s. Kelvin looked down at his test paper and started writing the answers. 3 times 1, 3. That was easy enough. 3 times 2 equals 6. Oh, that wasn't bad either. But what about 3 times 7 or 3 times 9 or 3 times 12? Kelvin stuck his pencil in his mouth and gnawed at the eraser. He knew he shouldn't. He knew he was going to need that eraser very soon. But he couldn't help it. When he was nervous, he chewed. And multiplication made him very nervous. 3 times 3 equals, 9? Yes, definitely, probably, maybe 9. 3 times 4 equals 14? No. That didn't look right. He tried to erase the answer, but ended up with a gooey wet smear. Kelvin sighed. Even if he managed to learn the 3s, there were still the 4s to manage, struggle through, and the 7s, and the 9s, and the numbers stretched to infinity. Kelvin felt the weight of all those numbers pressing down on him. It felt like the weight of the world. Time, called Mr. Jupiter. Pass your test forward, please. Across the room, Kelvin's best friend, Humphrey, punched his fist in the air. Kelvin knew Humphrey had passed his 14s. Behind him, Stanford raised his hand. Mr. Jupiter, he said, I think I passed my 34s. May I stay after school and do my 35s and 36s? Show off, muttered Kelvin under his breath. He chewed and swallowed more of his eraser. Then he laid his head on his desk. Oh, why do I have to be in 4th grade? He moaned softly to himself. It's too hard. Did you say something, Kelvin? Asked Mr. Jupiter. Kelvin looked up and shook his head. But to himself, he said, I wish I was in kindergarten again, where school was fun and easy. Zzz, crack! The loudspeaker buzzed and crackled. Then Mrs. Shorthand's disembodied voice filled the room. Mr. Jupiter, come in, Mr. Jupiter! The class giggled. Before becoming the school secretary, Mrs. Shorthand had been an air traffic controller. I read you loud and clear, Mrs. Shorthand, said Mr. Jupiter. Go ahead. Mrs. Fairchild needs a student helper in kindergarten. Class on the double. Do you roger that? I roger, replied Mr. Jupiter. Help is on the way. Zzz, crack! The loudspeaker buzzed and crackled off. Mr. Jupiter looked out across his classroom. Who would like to be a student helper this morning? Me, said Jackie. Me, repeated Humphrey. Ooh, grunted Ham. He stretched his hand toward the ceiling. Ooh. Mr. Jupiter looked past the boys. His gaze fell on Kelvin, who was still resting his head and gnawing on his eraser. Kelvin, you may go to the kindergarten room. The rest of you, please take your arithmetic books and turn to page 1026. Kelvin took the pencil out of his mouth and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He walked down the hall to the kindergarten room. The kindergartners were sitting on the carpet when he arrived. They turned to stare at him as he stepped through the door. I'm Kelvin, said Kelvin. Of course you are, chirped Mrs. Fairchild. A wide, white-toothed smile spread across her cheeks as she turned to her students and clapped her hands. Class, let's sing hello to Kelvin. 17 kindergartners burst into song. Hello, and how are you? We like you, and we hope you like us too. Kelvin's cheeks turned pink. I'm your helper, he explained. Oh, and such a big helper, too, said Miss Fairchild. I bet you're the biggest kindergartner in the whole school. No, stammered Kelvin. I'm a 4th grader. Oh, you silly Billy, said Miss Fairchild. Class, isn't Kelvin a silly Billy? Yes, chimed the class. They all smiled at him. Kelvin suddenly felt very confused and very nervous. He pulled out his pencil and chewed on the eraser. "Oh dear," said Miss Fairchild. "Boys and girls, can you tell Kelvin our rule about pencils?" "No chewing," they chimed. Miss Fairchild beamed. "That's right. Chewing is for beavers. Now put your pencil away and come sit down." For a second, Kelvin stood there uncertain. Then he shrugged. Circle time beat math time any time. Sticking the pencil back in his pocket, he moved toward the carpet. "Wait!" shrieked the little girl. "The boy isn't wearing a bus!" A yellow construction paper bus hung from a string around her neck. It read, "Emily." "He can't sit down if he's not wearing a bus." "Yeah," said a boy whose bus identified him as Mikey. "He has to have a bus." That's okay," said Kelvin. "I don't need a bus." "Yes, you do," said Mikey. "That's the rule." "Mikey's right, Kelvin," chirped Miss Fairchild. "All kindergartners wear buses." "But I'm a fourth grader," said Kelvin. Miss Fairchild didn't hear. She was too busy cutting the school bus out of yellow construction paper. "There, now all this bus needs is a name. Can you spell your name?" "Of course I can," said Kelvin indignantly. "What letter does it start with?" asked Miss Fairchild. "C," said Kelvin. "C!" exclaimed Miss Fairchild. "What a wonderful letter. Class, can you make the sound of the letter C?" Like a flock of crows, the kindergartners cried, "Caca, caca, caca." Kelvin felt his cheeks grow even hotter. Miss Fairchild clapped her hands. "Very good," she gushed. She wrote a big letter C on Kelvin's school bus, then asked, "Do you know what letter comes next? Sound it out if you need to." "A," answered Kelvin. "The next letter is A, followed by an L and a V and an I and an N. Calvin." Miss Fairchild beamed. "Did you hear that, class? Kelvin has already learned to spell his name. Let's give him 3 cheers. Ready? Hip, hip, hooray!" chimed the kindergartners. "Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!" Multiplication tables, thought Kelvin, were starting to look good. Miss Fairchild wrote the rest of Kelvin's name on the bus, then tied a piece of yarn to it and draped it around his neck. "Now you may sit," she said. He found a spot between a boy whose bus said Riley and a girl whose bus said Sydney. "Miss Fairchild," whined Mikey, "the new boy isn't using pretzel legs. He has to use pretzel legs. That's the rule." "Mikey's right, Kelvin," said Miss Fairchild. "All kindergartners use pretzel legs." "But I'm a fourth grader," Kelvin said again. Miss Fairchild didn't hear. She was too busy opening a big book and setting it on the easel. Kelvin tucked up his legs and followed along as the class read Chicka Chicka Boom Boom. Kelvin already knew the story, so it was easy. Next, they recited the days of the week. That was easy too. Even math time was easy. 1 cookie plus 1 cookie equals how many cookies, class? Said Miss Fairchild. The kindergartners were puzzled, but not Kelvin. 2, he cried, 2 cookies. Very good, gushed Miss Fairchild. Kelvin grinned. Math should always be this easy. School should always be this easy. Then Miss Fairchild clapped her hands again. Boys and girls, let's end circle time with something special. The squirrel dance. 17 eager kindergartners leaped to their feet, wrinkling their noses and wiggling their bottoms. They chanted, gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Wrinkle up your little nose, hold a nut between your toes. Gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Suddenly, Mikey pointed an accusing finger. Miss Fairchild, he whined. Kelvin didn't swish his bushy tail. He has to swish his bushy tail. That's the rule. All eyes fell on Kelvin. But I'm too big to swish, said Kelvin. I'm in 4th grade. Miss Fairchild didn't hear. In kindergarten, everyone swishes, she chirped. Come on, let's see your swish. Kelvin shook his head. Like this, said Miss Fairchild. She wiggled her ample bottom. See? No, said Kelvin. Don't be shy, coaxed Miss Fairchild. Just swish, swish, whined Mikey. Swish, shrieked Emily. Swish, 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 chimed the rest of the class. We're not leaving the carpet until you do, chirped Miss Fairchild. She smiled encouragingly, and Kelvin gave in. I hope Humphrey never finds out about this, he thought as he wiggled his hips and wrinkled his nose and pretended to hold a nut. I hope he never knows I swished my bushy tail. Thinking about Humphrey made Kelvin wonder what the rest of the class was doing. Were they reviewing the times tables? Learning fractions? Doing advanced calculus? Kelvin was pretty sure they weren't reciting the days of the week or doing the squirrel dance. Maybe, thought Kelvin, kindergarten's a little too easy. Maybe. Miss Fairchild clapped, interrupting his thoughts. Snack time, she said. Everyone take a seat at the tables. Snack time? All thoughts of fourth grade vanished as Kelvin headed for the table. Avoiding the swish-demanding Mikey, he took a seat between a boy with a buzz cut, whose school bus read Victor, and a girl holding a beanbag platypus. Her school bus said Alicia. Victor turned and stared at Kelvin. Kelvin stared back. Victor stuck a pudgy finger up his nostril. Kelvin looked away. Miss Fairchild sang out, Who wants a yummy cheese stick and a box of raisins? She passed out the snack. Victor took his finger out of his nose and stuck it in the box of raisins. I'm picking a winner, he announced, and he pulled out a plump raisin. For one moment, he balanced it on the very tip of his nose finger. Then, pop, both finger and raisin went into his mouth. Kelvin shuddered. Here was something that never happened in fourth grade. Peck, 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 peck. On his other side, Alicia made her bean-bag platypus waddle across the table. It attacked Kelvin's napkin with its little plastic bill. It lunged at his cheese stick. It nipped at his raisin box. Here was something else that never happened in fourth grade. The platypus whirled on Emily, sitting only a few seats away. Peck, 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 peck. It bit Emily's hand. Emily started to cry. Miss Fairchild rushed over. Where are our table manners, children? She asked. Victor, no picking. Picking is for chickens. Alicia, no pecking. Pecking is for woodpeckers. And Emily, she patted the sobbing girl's back. There, it's not a real bill. At the next table, Mikey leaped from his chair and started swishing again. But this time, he wasn't doing the squirrel dance. He was doing the potty dance. Miss Fairchild, he whined, I have to go. I have to. Uh-oh. Disgusted, Kelvin watched as a puddle formed around Mikey's left shoe. Here was something else that definitely never happened in fourth grade. Mikey's lips trembled. His eyes grew as wet as his pants. He started to cry. Emily joined him, louder than before. Victor stuck his finger back in his nose. Alicia's platypus pecked Sydney, and the girl sitting across from Kelvin went berserk. I want to go home. I want my mommy. Mommy, chanted the rest of the class. Next to Kelvin, Victor calmly transferred his finger to the other nostril. Help, thought Kelvin. I'm trapped in kindergarten. He imagined the peace and tranquility of his fourth grade classroom, everyone sitting quietly at their desk, memorizing their multiplication tables. It was a beautiful thought. I wish I was in fourth grade again, whispered Kelvin. Zzz, crack! Miss Fairchild, come in, Miss Fairchild. Can you send Kelvin Tallywong to the fourth grade, please? Over and out. Kelvin didn't hesitate. He ripped off his school bus and ran for the door, down the hall, toward his own classroom. He was ready to tackle the threes, the fours, the multiplication tables into infinity. Nothing was too hard. No, sirree. Excitedly, Kelvin burst through the door, then skittered to a stop. What was going on? Why was the whole class standing and wrinkling their noses and wiggling their bottoms? Humphrey waved. Hey, Kelvin, you're just in time. Look what Mr. Jupiter taught us. And as Kelvin stood, open-mouthed, his classmates chanted, gray squirrel, swish your bushy tail. Moral of the story, be careful what you wish for. It might come true. The Boy Who Cried Lunch Monitor. Mrs. Bunce ruled Aesop Elementary's lunchroom with an iron fist. No kid dared blow bubbles in his milk or slurp her spaghetti or stick a straw up his nose. If one of them did, Lunchroom Infraction! Mrs. Bunce would bellow through her bullhorn. 5 minutes on the wall. On the wall. Those 3 words struck fear into the heart of every student at Aesop Elementary, first graders and 5th graders alike. On the wall. It was Mrs. Bunce's favorite punishment, a form of torture so horrible that anyone who endured it never again left his bread crust uneaten or chewed with her mouth open. Still, at the beginning of every school year, there was always one kid fool enough to tangle with big, bad Bunce. You know what I'm having for lunch? The kid might holler. And before anyone could warn her, she would open her mouth so wide that everyone could see the glob of half-chewed bologna with mustard and pickle relish on pumpernickel lurking inside, and she would squeal, "Seafood!" The lunch monitor's vengeance was swift. "Lunchroom Infraction!" Mrs. Bunce would bellow. 5 minutes on the wall. The other students would shudder. Mrs. Bunce made the kid face the room with her back to the cold tiled wall. "I think you have something to say to your schoolmates," she would growl. "Huh?" The kid always looked bewildered. "An apology," Mrs. Bunce would continue. "You owe us all an apology." No one could bear to watch 100 elementary school students would quickly look down at their carrot sticks or stare at their orange slices. I don't understand." The kid was always red-faced and stammering by this time. Waves of humiliation were washing over her face. She was drowning in them. That was when Mrs. Bunce would pull the note card from her pocket, yellowed with age and wrinkled from much use. It had through the years been held in the quaking hands of dozens of students. Now it was this kid's turn. "Read it," Mrs. Bunce would say. The kid recognized defeat in a small, quavering voice, so unlike the voice that only moments earlier had shouted, "Seafood." She read, "I apologize for my rudeness and promise to use my best table manners for the next time I sit down to lunch." "Thank you," Mrs. Bunce would say. Then she walked away, leaving the kid to simmer in her own embarrassment for 5 long minutes on the wall. No wonder the children in Aesop Elementary's lunchroom sat up straight, ate in silence, and cleaned up all their trash. "But," asked Mr. Jupiter as he bit into the cook's liverwurst and cranberry sauce sandwich, "are the children happy? Do they enjoy lunchtime?" "Lunchtime isn't about enjoyment," Mrs. Bunce replied. "It's about discipline and maintaining order." At that moment, Mrs. Struggles raced into the lunchroom. "Bertha, come quick," she panted. "There's a traffic jam in the kindergarten drop-off lane. I need you and your bullhorn to untangle it." "I'm on the way," cried Mrs. Bunce. She rushed from the lunchroom. Mr. Jupiter followed. Left unmonitored, the students sat in silence for a moment. Then Rose cautiously leaned over and whispered in Missy's ear. Emberly quietly offered Ham a chocolate chip cookie. Lenny glanced furtively around the lunchroom. Then he took a big swig of his Mr. Fizz and burp! The doors of restraint were belched wide open. Jackie wildly pitched cheesy puffs into Kelvin's open mouth. Ashley A, Ashley B, and Ashley Z put their mashed potatoes together and built a snowman. Amisha gargled with chocolate milk. The only 4th grader not laughing or talking or joining in the fun was Melvin Moody. Melvin was used to not joining in. He was used to not being a part of the group. Somehow in Mr. Jupiter's class, Melvin always managed to blurt out the wrong thing or pick his nose when someone was looking or fumble the ball at recess and lose the championship kickball game. This kind of behavior tended to keep other kids away. Now Melvin was suddenly seized with uncontrollable urge. Leaping to his feet, he cupped his hands around his mouth and cried, "Lunch monitor! Lunch monitor!" Fear swept through the room. Pretzels were yanked from nostrils. Bread crusts were swallowed whole. The entire student body smoothed their hair, sat up straight, and hoped their cheeks weren't too flushed with joy. A minute passed, then another and another. "She's not coming," Victoria finally said. Lenny whirled on Melvin. "You did it," he shouted. "You ruined the fun." All eyes turned to Melvin. Jackie booed. Rachel and Lil stuck out their tongues. Bruce threw a banana peel. It hit Melvin in the back of the head, and Melvin loved it. "I'm the center of attention," he thought. He held his chin high. For days afterward, Melvin felt like a celebrity. "There's that kid from the lunchroom," whispered Bernadette. "What a loser," whispered Ham. "What's his name again?" asked Lil. The others shrugged. All too soon, however, Melvin's celebrity faded. By week's end, he was a nobody again. That was when Miss Turner wobbled into the lunchroom. Instead of her sensible slushing shoes, she was wearing a very spiky, very strappy, very purple pair of high-heeled sandals. "Bertha," said Miss Turner, swaying slightly, "you've got a phone call in the office." "I'm busy," grumbled Miss Bunce. Eyes narrowed, she plucked a recyclable can from the regular trash and looked around for the rule breaker. "But it's your mother, the Marine," said Miss Turner. She grabbed the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. "She's calling from boot camp." Mrs. Bunce hesitated, then dropped the can into the recycling bin and headed for the office. At that moment, Miss Turner spied Mr. Jupiter giving the cook a recipe for yak and cheese, a delicacy among the nomads of the Gobi Desert, he said. She took a wobbly step toward him and, "Oops," said Mr. Jupiter. He caught the librarian before she hit the floor. "One must be careful when wearing such lofty shoes." Miss Turner melted into his arms. "Dear me," she sighed weakly. "I think I've twisted my ankle." "Allow me to help you back to the library," offered Mr. Jupiter. They limped away, leaving the lunchroom unmonitored. Within seconds, first graders crawled under tables. Second graders squeezed the cream filling out of their cupcakes. Third graders blew bits of fruit cocktail from their straws. As for the fourth graders, they raced their sandwich cookies down the length of the table. "And Oreo takes the lead," said Jackie in her sports announcer's voice, followed by Hydrox and Girl Scout. Then, "Lunch monitor," Melvin cried. Quick as a wink, straws were stuck back into the milk carton. Sandwich cookies were popped into mouths. Flushed and panting, everyone braced themselves for nothing. "Oh, not again," moaned Kelvin. He whirled on Melvin. "What's your problem, kid?" But Melvin didn't have a problem because once again, in the days that followed, he was talked about, recognized, somebody. Fame was fleeting. By the middle of the following week, Melvin was as forgotten as last month's vocabulary words. That was when, during lunch, crash! "Ugh! Mayday!" cried Mrs. Shorthand, who had been standing on a swivel chair and hanging a sign in the hallway. "Mayday!" Mrs. Bunce rushed to help her. Left alone in the lunchroom, the students didn't waste a second. Everyone laughed or joked or blew milk out of their nose. At the fourth grade table, Jackie invented a game called Flick Your Pee, and everyone was playing. Everyone, that is, except Melvin. Then he saw her, Mrs. Bunce, coming down the hallway, closer and closer. Lunch monitor, he cried. "Yeah, right," drawled Lenny. He flicked a pea into Missy's applesauce. Mrs. Bunce reached the door. Melvin hopped up and down. He waved his arms. He cried even more loudly, Lunch monitor! "Knock it off, kid," said Kelvin. "Nobody believes you." He aimed a pea at Stanford. Mrs. Bunce pushed on the wide swinging doors. Panicked and desperate, Melvin leaped onto the fourth grade table. He hopped up and down, waved his arms, and cried at the top of his voice, Lunch monitor! His behavior finally grabbed their attention. Everyone stopped joking and laughing and flicking peas. They turned to look at Melvin just as Mrs. Bunce burst into the lunchroom. "Lunchroom Infraction!" she bellowed through her bullhorn. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of Melvin, who was still happy, waving and shouting on top of the table. Unbelievable, she said. I'm gone just a few moments and look how you behave. Melvin Moody, that's 5 minutes on the wall. Moral of the story: liars are not believed, even when they tell the truth.